Well, hey, good evening to you. At least whenever this video is published, it will be Wednesday evening at the end of May. I've been in quarantine so long I don't even know the date. But we are going through the book of James with the Dewey Avenue Church of Christ. I'm Dale Parsley, minister for the Dewey Avenue Church of Christ. Today we're going to cover James chapter 5, verses 7 through 12. I told my kids a couple weeks ago, and I think they were quite surprised about it. I didn't grow up around here. I grew up actually in Columbus. And it was in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s that I was in high school, graduated the year 2000. And at that time in Columbus, there were more jobs than people that could fill the jobs, basically. And at that time, even in high school, you could go to a lot of places and get a job. And I say this loosely, you can get a job just about anywhere. Obviously, if you didn't have a college degree and some jobs required or some kind of training, well, but any job that required a high school diploma or less, you could go just about anywhere and get a job. And I actually had a lot of jobs I would consider as far as today times go, and where I've lived since I've gotten out of high school. I had a lot of jobs. Every few months, I'd just go switch job, get another job, and I was the only one. Tons of high schoolers did that all the time, just hop from one job to another, basically, whether if it paid more or I just don't like this job anymore. I don't like who I work with or whatever, or somebody made me mad one time, so I'm going to go get another job. And so, yeah, it was just really, really easy to get a job. And the reason why I mention that is sometimes we are under the impression that a new job will make me happy. A new environment will make me happy. More money will make me happy. Do you get that? And while I'm not saying shame on you if you switch jobs because it puts you in a better financial decision, or it is perhaps a better environment for you to thrive as a Christian. I'm not saying that that's wrong. Okay, don't misunderstand that. Okay, but what I am saying is, if you have a person who thinks, I'll be happy if I get this new job, and then they get that new job, and then they're not happy, and then a few months or a year later they go to get another job, maybe the problem is not the job, but maybe the problem is with the person. Maybe the real problem is it doesn't matter what kind of job you get and how much education or training you get in order to get that dream job, whatever it may be. Maybe the problem's you. I don't know, that sounds harsh, doesn't it? The problem's you, and it doesn't matter. You're still going to be unhappy. Now, why do I say that? I say that because if we rely on our jobs as our source of joy, then what about those that we read about in James 5, verses 1 through 6, who had no choice but the job that they had? You remember, just kind of by way of review, do you remember in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 5, we talked about the persecuting employer. And there were some Jewish Christians, by the way, who had a job as basically you would consider a day laborer. You were a worker in a field. You were a farmer, but the land wasn't yours. You were working in someone else's land. And consider how they were being treated. We've already considered, for instance, the estate of these persecuting employers, what's going to happen to them. Come now, you rich, weep and howl, for your miseries are coming upon you. You're going to be punished. Why? Because of how you're treating your workers. What are you doing? Well, you're not paying them. You're dishonest with them. You either agreed to pay them a certain amount and then didn't pay them, or you're just underpaying them what they're deserved. And it's not that you couldn't afford to pay them, because the fact is, as you look at verse 3, your gold and your silver is corroded. And what is it? You have so much, you're wastefully hoarding You're so greedy that your stuff's going bad and the people who work for you are starving and suffering. You don't care, you know. And my point about the whole, excuse me, job thing is this. What other options did they have in the first century? Where could they go to get a new job? They didn't have the options that we have today and that I had back then. Well, as a result of that, you're in an economy where it's very limited as to what kind of work you can find, and the working conditions are bad, and not only are they bad, but you're being mistreated. Well, if our joy is in our job, then these individuals should be just downright miserable. And maybe their working conditions were downright miserable, but as Christians, we understand that our source of joy comes beyond our job and our career. It comes with our relationship with God. And we need to remember that. I hear Christians all the time talk, well, how much better their lives would be if they could just get a new job. And maybe there's some truth to that. But you know what? At the same time, maybe it doesn't matter what job you have, as I said earlier. Maybe we need to look within ourselves and fix ourselves. And in reality, that'll fix our source of joy. So in verses 7 through 12, as you consider the terrible conditions that, and we looked at that last week, that these Jewish Christians likely had from their persecuting employer, I want to consider the persecuted employees now. And how does God demand Christians to act, or how does God want Christians to respond in difficult working conditions? Well, let's just read the text first. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. So I think there's 4 points here from this text, maybe 5, we'll see here in a second, that I think we can point out in regard to how do you respond being in a situation like these early Christians were in. Well, in the first place, as you go back and look at verse 7, notice here God commands us to exercise patience. Now, that word here, patience, means to be long-tempered. John MacArthur notes that's exactly what it means, and it is opposed to being short-tempered. And this has to do with being long-tempered or long-suffering, being very patient with people. He says patience is enduring someone who is mistreating you, and it is not being angry and not being full of vengeance, in other words. It's very similar to the word in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, where God is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Warren Wiersbe notes that many Greek scholars think that this phrase here, patience or long-suffering, refers to patience with respect to persons, while oftentimes you see the word in our English Bibles translated as endurance. This actually refers to patience with respect to conditions or situations in life. So there is a sense of don't give up, don't lose temper and just retaliate in anger. In other words, I know if you study the history of man, sometimes when you see that revolutions have occurred or wars have, been fought, it has been because of enough's enough from this mistreatment. And we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to do something about it. Well, God here is not, condoning Christians in particular in the first century here to take up their farming tools and go against their landowners. He's not telling you to start a revolution. He's actually saying be patient. Be patient with them. Why? Well, notice, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. We're going to get to that in a second. Now, notice he gives the illustration of a farmer. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. William Barclay notes that the early rain was the rain of late October and early November, without which the seed could not germinate. And then the late rain was the rain of April and May, without which the grain could not mature. And so the farmer needs patience to wait until nature does her work. Warren Wiersbe points out that no crop appears overnight. Well, I think obviously if you've ever planted something, you know that. It takes time, doesn't it? But just as no crop appears overnight and no farmer has control over the weather, too much rain can cause the crop to rot. Too much sun can burn it up. An early frost can kill the crop. And he notes that in order to endure a season for harvest time, basically, long suffering is something that a farmer must have, and must have with the weather, by the way. Now, obviously, a farmer can take action whenever there is a lack of rain or too much rain, or if something along those lines. There's something you could do, but there is a sense there of endurance that is seen here, okay, in this illustration. And so James says, exercise patience. You doesn't give you the right to retaliate, okay, and retaliate in unlawful ways that God would not have. So notice he says then to establish your hearts as well. And you look here, the phrase establish your hearts means to stabilize and strengthen your hearts as a result of that. Again, it's the concept don't give up. And so in the second place here, as you notice, it's mentioned, really referred to 3 times. There's also being expecting of the second coming of Christ. Be expectant of his return, in other words. Notice here, therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord, as you see in verse 7. Drop down in verse 8. Notice, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. You see that? Drop down and look at verse 9. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. So on 3 different references, James mentions the second coming of Christ as a motivation to be patient. Jesus is coming back. Because he's going to return one day, you be patient. Now, I think it's necessary for us to consider the idea here of this speaks in one sense of how long to be patient until the coming of the Lord. And I think it's necessary to point out a belief that some have in the churches of Christ and in other religious groups, and it is called the doctrine of AD 70. Well, I call it AD 70. Some people have other phrases for it, realized eschatology, or, there's a bunch of different words I guess you can call it. But anyway, AD 70 is the idea that Jesus returned to this earth in AD 70 when the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem and in turn destroyed the Jewish nation as well. And they also believe that because Christ returned in AD 70, every reference of Scripture in the New Testament in regard to the second coming of Christ, well, that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about some future second coming. It already happened, in other words, in AD 70. And so there is no second coming of Christ, as most of us would understand it. And when one dies, everyone just goes to heaven or hell. And by the way, this earth will not be destroyed either. It will exist and continue on forever, too. And the reason why I bring this doctrine up that some people believe, it's not very popular view. The reason why I mention it is this is one of the verses they refer to here. In particular, when you look at verse 8, where it says, the coming of the Lord is at hand. And say they take this basically and they say, see, at hand means soon to come. So James, in other words, could not be talking about a future return of Christ in our lifetime because he said it was at hand, basically back then. Well, I do think it's a good point. At hand does typically mean soon to come. And overall, that's the meaning of the word here. However, I think there are some things to point out and to consider. Number one, I think it's good to consider that as you go in the Old Testament, for instance, and particularly look at the book of Joel, chapter 2, there's a phrase in the book of Joel called the day of the Lord, which is very similar to the word here, the coming of the Lord, right? And if you notice in Joel chapter 2, the phrase day of the Lord is not always referring to the same event. In fact, in the Old Testament, the phrase day of the Lord sometimes is used in reference to a temporary punishment on a nation. But then other times you'll find that it seems that it's referring to the second coming of Christ overall. At the very least, it's referring to different events for different nations, or one big event where the world, as you look at 2 Peter chapter 3, and all that is in it will be burned up and destroyed. And so my point is it not possible that the phrase here, the coming of the Lord here in James, cannot have a similar meaning? I mean, maybe James is, in other words, speaking here in verse 8 of the destruction of Jerusalem. These landowners are going to get theirs when Rome comes in AD 70. He might be, that might be right. But just because the phrase coming of the Lord uh, is referring to AD 70, does that mean, in other words, that at every reference in the New Testament where it speaks of the second coming of Christ is speaking of Jesus coming at the destruction of Jerusalem? And my answer to that is no, because when you begin to look at other passages of Scripture regarding the return of Christ, okay, there is clearly passages that speak of a future event where everything will be destroyed. For instance, 2 Peter chapter 3 is an example of one of those. When Jesus promised to officially return again, as you look at Acts chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, when Jesus ascended into heaven, notice there were angels that basically told the disciples there, hey, when Jesus, as you've seen him leave physically, visibly, and audibly, he's going to come back just like that as well. Well, that didn't happen in AD 70. So there's going to be a visible, audible return of Christ. Just as Jesus came, left, so he'll come back. You understand that? So, in other words, every other passage of Scripture that speaks of the return of Christ cannot be, in other words, speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem. You understand that? Okay? So keep that in mind. It is possible that maybe James is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem here, but that doesn't mean that it's like that in every passage. Secondly, I don't want to spend all my time on that. Is it not possible, though, that just as the day of the Lord can have more than one meaning, and it does, the phrase at hand can have more than one meaning? If you think about our life and how long it has lived in regard to eternity, the idea of the return of Christ being at hand, well, yeah, this life is short. And even if you live to be 150 years, the second coming of Christ is still at hand. You understand that? So in light of eternity, it is short. It is soon to come. And in one sense, the idea here too, and I really think here, is God is not saying when Jesus is returning. In fact, Jesus talked about that in Matthew chapter 24. No one knows the return of Christ, okay? And so at hand, I think, is more or less the idea of it can happen at any moment. Always be ready, always be expecting, in other words, the second coming of Christ, the return of Christ. In light of eternity, life ending is at hand. You remember when we were in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17? Those Jewish Christians who thought, well, I'm going to go to a particular city. I'm going to make business plans, spend some time at this city and sell and make a profit. And what did James say? Hey, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. What is your life? It is a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Life can come to an end at any moment, by the way, okay? And one of the ways life can come to an end is not just death, but the second coming or the return of Jesus Christ as well. And so James is telling these Christians here, okay, hey, you need to be patient. God knows what you're going through, okay? The Lord is compassionate and merciful, as you look at verse 11. He feels for you, as we would say. He understands what you're going through, okay? And guess what? Be patient, because one day they're going to pay. One day Judgment Day is coming. And we don't know when it's coming, but it's going to happen sooner than you think. You understand that? It's going to happen unexpectedly. In light of eternity, it's at hand because it can happen at any moment. And so these persecuted employees, all right, these Jewish Christians who are going through these hard economic conditions, exercise patience and continue and put in your mind the expectant return of Christ. Now notice number 3, the other thing that James points out is we should also eliminate grumbling too. Eliminate grumbling. Now, what does it mean to grumble? Notice verse 9. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Again, behold, the judge is standing at the door. The Life Application Bible Commentary notes that this word here, grumble, it translates from a word that describes a bad attitude which expresses itself in constant grumbling, constant complaining. Have we ever been like that? Where the world it just stinks. Everything is bad. Everything is horrible. I think if you watch the news enough, you can develop that attitude, by the way. I'm not saying you're wrong if you watch the news a lot, but it seems to can give us a terrible attitude. That just constant grumbling. There's always something wrong with anything and everything, and with someone or something. Well, that may be true, but that doesn't mean we should have a bad attitude and an outlook on life of just, as if we're just constantly drinking something bitter or smelling something stinky, Philippians chapter 2, for instance, talks about, as Christians, we should do all things without murmuring or complaining or grumbling or disputing, whatever translations you have there. Why? Because as Christians, as you notice, the whole message from the book of Philippians is we're to have joy in our life. And if we're constantly grumbling, we're not going to be people who are joyous. And the other thing, as you look at Philippians 2:13 and 14, is when Paul said, don't be this person who's constantly grumbling and has this terrible attitude. Why? Because we shine as lights in a crooked and perverse world. We're not letting our light shine, in other words, if we're always grumbling, basically. Okay? And there is in a lot of ways here where the situation or circumstances with these early Christians, can't you see why they perhaps would always be grumbling or complaining? I mean, whenever you have a bad day at work, does it just stay at work? No. No. You take that bad day at work home with you in the car, don't you? You're impatient with the slow person in front of you because you just want to get home. You're tired of the red lights and the traffic jams, and and you really get angrier than maybe you normally would once that person cuts you off too, right? You just want to run every red light as long as it's pink, right? Or zoom right through the yellow lights, not run the red lights, right? And just get home. And then when you get home, what is it? Well, it's kind of that expression where you kick the cat because the dog chewed up something, You take it out on the cat because of the dog's mistakes. And, are you nice to your kids? Are you nice to your wife or to your husband? It affects every aspect of your life. Can you see that? Cannot we be like that as well? Well, the answer to that is yeah. Brother Woods notes that this word here denotes fretfulness, impatience with others, it's the disposition to blame others for one's distress. It's a person who grumbles against one another, who's quarrelsome, who's disposed to blame their brethren, a person who's easy to take offense here, a person who's quick to find fault with others. And what is it? This is a person who has a bad job and is just has this grumbling attitude. And James says, stop that. Okay? Stop being that person who can never see anything good in others or in anything in themselves or any situation in life, who's always critical of others. Stop that. Change your attitude. Why? Because the judge is standing at the door. Because of eternity, as perhaps we would think. One day, this is going to be over with. One day, as Christians, we'll receive our reward and our prize, and that gives us hope, and that is our source of joy, and that helps us to endure hardship. That helps us to be patient. So change our attitude, eliminate the grumbling, in other words. And now notice, in a further example to exercise this patience, notice he calls on us to examine the Old Testament prophets as well. Notice verse 10, it says, "My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them as blessed who endure." You have heard, for instance, an example of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and is very merciful. The word here, example, Brother Guy Woods notes, means a copy to be imitated here. And the proper way to endure affliction is, hey, how do I handle this? Well, let's see what others did. Let's look at their example. And one of the great examples of patience in enduring hardship, well, look at the Old Testament prophets. Look at what they went through and still did not give up their faith and remain faithful to God. The word endurance here, William Barclay notes, describes not a passive patience, but a gallant spirit which breasts the tides of doubt and sorrow and disaster and comes out with faith still stronger on the other side. He notes there may be a faith which never complained or questioned, but still greater is the faith which was tortured by questions and still believed. Warren Wiersbe, practically speaking, notes this. He says, "The prophets encourage us by reminding us that God cares for us when we go through sufferings for his sake. Elijah announced to wicked King Ahab that there would be a drought in the land for 3.5 years, and Elijah himself had to suffer in that drought. Jeremiah was arrested as a traitor and even thrown into an abandoned well to die. It was God, though, who fed Jeremiah and protected him throughout that terrible siege of Jerusalem." He notes the impact of a faithful, godly life carries much power, and our patience in times of suffering is a testimony to others. The example that James used ought to encourage us to spend more time in the Bible, he notes, getting acquainted with these heroes of the faith. Remember Romans chapter 15 and verse 4, "For whatever things are written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope." He notes the better we know the Bible, the more God can encourage us in the different experiences of life. One person in particular that James notes is Job. And if you consider Job and the things that Job went through, and as you study the life of Job, William Barclay further notes in regard to Job, he said, "As we read the tremendous drama of his life, and we see him passionately resenting what has come upon him, passionately questioning the conventional arguments of his so-called friends, passionately agonizing over the terrible thought that God might have forsaken him, few men have spoken such passionate words as he did. But the great fact about him is that in spite of all the agonizing questionings which tore at his heart, he never lost his faith in God. He struggled in questions and sometimes even defied, but the flame of his faith was never extinguished." I think that's a good point about Job. you see overall in the midst of this storm, the hand of God that cares and is compassionate and is merciful even to our flaws as we struggle with them, even in very difficult times. So notice as you consider this text, now James close out in verse 12 and encouraging us to examine our thoughts and our words as well. Notice verse 12. Perhaps some may wonder, well, why is this thrown in the midst of this? Well, I think it makes perfect sense. Notice it says, but above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. By the way, if you cross-reference that, you'll find that in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 36. One thing I have not really mentioned about the book of James, if you would sometime, if you want to do an in-depth study of James, compare the writings of James with the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. You'll find there is a lot of similarities. I wouldn't so much say overlap, but there is a lot of comparisons to what Jesus taught there and what James is actually teaching here as well. And one example here is in Matthew chapter 5 in verses 33 through 36, where Jesus talks about how there was this elaborate system among some of the Jews in the first century where the more sacred something you swore by, the more binding your oath was. If you were going to say you were going to do something, the more sacred it was, the more you had to keep your word, basically. The less sacred it was, the more you didn't have to keep your word. So they kind of devised this elaborate system basically to not be reliable and dependable with your word, and is really in some ways was a loophole for lying, essentially. And Jesus says, don't do that. You know, if you're going to be my disciple, my follower, just be a person of your word. Let your yes mean yes, and your no's mean no, basically. Plain and simple, right? That's what he's saying here. And that's what James is saying here as well. Think about this. In a time of difficulty, uh, it's very easy to become angry and impatient. And oftentimes we can think foolish things when we're angry and impatient, and we can say foolish things when we're angry and impatient. And in turn, we also can think and make foolish decisions when we're angry and impatient. And so in a time of others mistreating us, we can just lash out and say something of, I'll never do this again, or here's what I'm going to do to get back at them. And we eat our words because we don't sometimes follow through. We make foolish vows. We say things we ought not to say. Maybe even here, perhaps James is even talking about the idea of, you know what? Those who are mistreating me, if I can get back at them and make some vow, but if I don't have to keep this vow and essentially lie to them, I'm going to do it. Now, James says, be a person of your word. Think about what you say before you say it. Remember James chapter 1? Let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Think about what you say. But in response to others, let your yes be yes and your no's no. Don't be a person who is dishonest and deceitful or lies, but who's honest and upright, in other words. So examine your thoughts, which in turn, remember, leads to your words, and examine what we say in difficult times like that. It is so easy to say and do foolish things whenever we're at our wits' end, isn't it? It really is. But stand by our words, but be cautious of the words that we say at the same time. All right. I appreciate you guys hopefully getting through this lesson. Maybe I put you to sleep. I don't know. Lord willing, our next lesson, we're actually going to finish the book of James. We're going to look at James chapter 5, beginning in verse 13 through the end of the chapter, which is also the end of the book. So appreciate you tuning in. Hope you have a good week, the rest of the week. Certainly, if you have any comments or questions, put them in the comment section below. You guys have a great week again, and God bless.